All right, today we're going to be digging into a rear differential on a Kawasaki Prairie 400. This is a common problem on these Prairie 400s to have rear end issues. One of the things, it gets water in there. A lot of times a speedo cable area will break out, or somebody will leave that cable out, get water in it. Otherwise, the gears loosen up, the bearings get loose, the splines on the bevel gear get worn, and we're going to go through and show you how to replace those gears, how to replace those bearings, and reinstall seals and new bearings in there. So the first thing you're going to want to do, we've already drained this oil. It's a 17mm bolt on the bottom. Now you wouldn't actually have to do that, but it's just going to make cleanup a little bit easier, as when you pull this apart, oil will go everywhere if you haven't drained it already. So I suggest while it's still on the four-wheeler, go ahead and drain that. You've got a couple different places here that your skid plate mounts up to. 1, 2, 3 is where that skid plate comes undone. You don't actually have to pull that skid plate to drain your oil, but since we're splitting this differential in half, that skid plate will have to come off. And then obviously we have your oil fill here, and we'll show you how to do that towards the end of the video here. I've showed you in another video how to remove this differential off of the back end, off of the swing arm of the four-wheeler. So let's dig into this here. We've got 12mm bolts all the way around, 2, 4, 6, 8 bolts, and I use an impact driver and just go ahead and remove those. And I've got them all loose right now, that way it goes a little bit quicker. You can pull all 8 of those out, and they're all the same size, so you don't need to keep them in any sort of order at all. Now there's 2 different places on this differential where you can put a screwdriver and pry, and you want to make sure that you don't pry anywhere except for these 2 places, one on the top, one on the bottom. And there's enough room to get a screwdriver in there, and you can kind of twist. Doing that in those 2 places isn't going to damage your seal area, so I suggest you doing it in those 2 places. We've got the side cover off here of your differential. This is one of the bearings that's loose. This one's not as loose as the other bearings, but we'll go ahead and replace these at the same time. We've got this off here. You pull this seal up, pull it up this way. Go ahead and take your bearing, then take a, well, you can use a bearing mount installer, and I'll show you that here in a little bit. Set it in there, tap it out that way. You don't have to have an actual bearing puller for this bearing here. It's damaged. You could actually use a chisel or something to get that out if you needed to, but a bearing installer is sometimes easier. Now we've got on this side, it's a shim, and they make these in many different sizes, and what that does is put more pressure down onto this gear. You want to make sure that this washer is always there. Make sure there's something always there, and that puts pressure between this gear and this gear. And I'll pull that off there and show you. These are the splines that wear out here, and this gear and these splines are separate, so you can't replace those if, say, your gear is good but your splines are bad, or vice versa. You can replace that. Now they're not going to be cheap. Sometimes you can find a good used differential for the same price as replacing either one of those. So there is your gear. Like I said, when you're putting that spacer in there, that shim pushes more pressure down on this gear, pushes it down onto this one, making a tighter fit so there's not as much play there. Now you can see on this one, you've got your speedo gear. Gear is actually worn on this. If you're gonna put a speedo gear back in here, you may want to replace this gear, although where this is hitting, I'm not totally sure that it's gonna even cause any issues, but to be in new condition, you wanna replace this gear. That goes all the way through here. This gear is fine. So that is your main gear there, your transfer gear, and they call it transfer gear because it's taking power from one direction and turn it to the other one, to your axle. So that is your main gear. These are sold as a set, or they should come as a set. So you want to do this gear and this gear at the same time. Obviously these here, this bearing is completely shot. This is where your speedo gear would run through, and it would go all the way down and sit into this housing here. There's a little area for that gear to sit down in here. You can see when I put the screwdriver through there, it's not quite long enough, but it would sit down in there. That's to keep that gear from moving back and forth. Make sure it's always making contact with that larger gear. So the next thing you're gonna wanna do is flip this over, or flip this up. And it's a lot easier to do this in a vise, but just to show you a video here, or make the video, I'm not gonna put it in the vise. I'm gonna try to do it without. And here is it from the top side. Now the next thing we're gonna do is take something to hold this. Now I used channel locks on here. You wanna make sure that as soon as you spin this nut off, these aren't gonna move. So you don't want this slipping. You don't want your channel locks or your vice grips or anything slipping when you remove this nut, because you're gonna grind down these splines here. And you can see already that these are worn, which is one of the issues with this. So this takes a 19 millimeter socket to pull this nut, and it's just regular thread. So turn it off counterclockwise. And that is going to allow you to replace this gear. Now you don't actually have to. The tool that we have, you've got to pull this coupling here, or this gear here, before you can get to this larger nut here. So if you've got a tool where you can slide it all the way down on top of this, and I'm not sure if Kawasaki makes that gear, from what I understand, you have to pull this gear to get down to that large nut there. So we've got a washer here that we'll pull off. There's a O-ring here. There's an O-ring here. You want to make sure that's in good condition. Replace that. Probably come with your bearing set. And then you've got an O-ring clear down here at the bottom. You want to make sure that that gets replaced, or at least is in good condition. Now you can see here our bearings are completely shot, missing several balls in that assembly there. Next thing you're going to want to do, and this is an important step, as if you don't do this, you will destroy your housing here. Take a Allen wrench, and in the side of your differential is a little small Allen screw. And you unscrew this. You don't have to unscrew it all the way, but you can see there when you start unscrewing that you'll have movement down here. This screw runs all the way down and make sure this nut stays tight so it doesn't ever loosen up. So you have to remove that screw before you start pulling this nut. Next thing, like I said, we've got a tool to remove this, and this is just something we've welded a nut on here. We've got a spacer and then a nut on top, and that's just a simple way of doing it. It costs about $6 as opposed to the one from Kawasaki that cost you 6 times that, but either way works good. The other thing that you can do, and it's a little bit harder when you're going back together, but grab a chisel, put it on here, and you want to make sure you're turning the right way. One thing you want to make sure that your chisel isn't clear up here getting into this housing. You want to make sure that you're just on this nut, and then when you go to order parts, I would order a new one of these nuts, as it's going to be damaged. Now going back together, you can do that same thing, but I'll let you know that if you're putting any kind of pressure at all on this, you're going to damage this nut here next time. It may not go back together as easily. Now this nut doesn't actually seal anything, so if it is boogered up slightly, you'll be okay, but you want to make sure that you don't damage it too much, and maybe the next person won't be able to get it off. Now we've loosened that nut just to speed things up here. We'll go ahead and spin that all the way off and pull the nut out here. Now that nut is ready to come off. There it is there, about 3/8 of an inch thick probably. Now this gear is ready. You know what, these bearings got to come out. Now this bearing will come out, and then that gear will come out. Now this gear, what I generally do is you can take a small chisel here. You want to make sure, again, not getting into the housing, but a lot of times it doesn't take much pressure at all to remove this gear and that bearing. But you want to make sure you're not damaging anything when you're tapping on these. You can see already that it's coming out. There. See, it doesn't take much to come out. Even if that bearing was good, it still should slide out very easily. So we've got this bearing, obviously needs replaced. I just take and tap down. do on either side. You want to be careful that you are being mindful of these threads here. You're not laying it sideways, put it straight up and down, tap on it. Just by doing that, you're not going to damage these threads unless you're really twisting on it there, unless that bearing for some reason seized onto this shaft. You want to make sure that you do something else. What you can do is thread your nut on there all the way, set your socket down on top of there. There goes all the balls to that bearing. You can slide it out that way. Now we've got another bearing on this side. We can do the same thing. This actually, to remove it, you just take and push down on it like that. That'll push it out there. It's already starting to come out. It doesn't take much at all to do that. Same way with that seal there. And that is, we've got a bushing in here that can come out. And that bushing just sits right on this gear, or the bottom of the shaft here. And that one should be replaced as well when we're doing it. So that is rebuilding the rear end on a Kawasaki Prairie 400. If you have questions, let me know. If you need that bearing kit, let me know. A little bit of debris down inside here. Make sure that's all completely cleaned up. You can see some sludge there on that housing. And that once we get this cleaned up, this will be in really good condition and be in great shape. Go back together and we'll work just fine. Thanks for watching.